Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to our third session on the webinar series on utilization of voluntary consensus standards and conformity assessment. Well, we are going to be providing an overview and perspectives of the national standard bodies. As we generally do in our sessions, we're going to be oh, I'm sorry that I do not know why I cannot. Okay. Some housekeeping messages. As you may recall, this session is being recorded for future availability at the Coalition's website. We do have simultaneous translation for English, Portuguese, and Spanish. You can access that through the icon at the bottom of your screens. Also, microphones of the participants are closed to prevent background noise. Therefore, we could appreciate if you can post your questions for the panelists using the Q&A feature that it is also available at the bottom of your screens. And for the speakers, we appreciate you having your cameras on during your presentations and during the Q&A session. May we facilitate the work of the interpreters. And as you saw in the latest update on our agenda, we are going to be having Catherine Serrano from the US FDA office sharing a welcome message for the audience. And then we will get into our panel discussion where we do have representatives from Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, the national standard bodies for these countries, where they are going to be sharing their role in the development of international standards and national and regional standards. So with this, I will proceed to introduce Catherine Serrano. Catherine is director for the FDA's Latin America office. She has over 15 years of experience in the medical device field, with the last 9 years spent in FDA's Office of In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. At the FDA, Katie has worked in a variety of technical, policy, leadership, and management positions, including joining the agency as part of the inaugural class of Commissioner Fellows in 2008, working as scientific reviewer and serving as the Diabetes Diagnostic Devices Branch Chief and the Deputy Director of FDA's Division of Chemistry and Technology Devices. She also served as the technical and policy lead for the agency's efforts related to laboratory developed tests. Ms. Serrano received a Bachelor of Science degree in Biomedical Engineer and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Before working at the Food and Drug Administration, Ms. Serrano held positions as a regulatory affairs professional at Boston Scientific Corporation and as a biomedical engineer at the United States National Institutes of Health, supporting new programs focused on cutting-edge technologies in the field of bioengineering. Catherine, thank you very much. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sandra. And I just want to say buenos dias, bom dia, and welcome to everyone who's participating in this session today. This is the third in a webinar series dedicated to international standards for regulatory decision-making. And international standards are just so important. They really do help. They're the sort of critical building blocks to help build systems that are more harmonized and efficient, both for regulators and industry. And all of that helps improve quality, safety, and efficacy of medical devices overall. In previous sessions, we've heard how important international standards are to operationalize regulatory reliance, how they can impact trade agreements and those obligations, and also how different activities that are being conducted by the standards development organizations on the harmonization of standards. Today, we have the privilege to hear from the national standards bodies from Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico and Peru, regarding their experiences and participation in international standards development. And we're really interested to hear all that they have to share with us today. In general, we just so appreciate the opportunity to provide these educational webinars as part of the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. These webinar series are always most helpful and impactful when all of you who are participating today engage in the conversation. So we really do hope that you come with lots of questions, comments, sharing of your experiences during the Q&A portion today. And with that, I will turn the floor back over to Sandra for the rest of the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And now, Corey, the floor is yours for coordinating, moderating our session. Thank you very much for your support.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to switch to Spanish, please. So if you need, go to the translation system. Muy buenos días, bienvenidos a todos.
Good morning and welcome everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to moderate the session. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Pan American Coalition for Technical Standards, so I'm really related with all the entities that are going to present today. The objective of the session is to provide the perspectives from the international standards entities point of view on how the regulators develop, keep, and maintain this consensus in standards internationally so that they can put in practice reliability, the confidence, regulatory confidence, and to get the approval of quality medical devices that are safe, interoperable, efficient, and that could be used in all health services and that are accessible also for patients in the Americas. As Catherine mentioned, we've heard in the two prior sessions of the series the best regulatory practices that require the use of standards and international references to achieve a regulation that will facilitate populations' access to medical devices and to guarantee compliance of all legal commitments, international legal commitments of all the members that are part of the WTO, as well as to get all the benefits and the recommendations of the WHO and follow them through in the same sense. We've also learned about the program for standards and conformity of the FDA in the United States. And for them, this model has presented many benefits when compared to the one that meant that they had to develop regulations with their own internal requirements. In the prior session, we also heard about the role of the standard development bodies in the different areas and how because of the diversity of medical devices is required to assure the safety, the performance, and the quality of the same, and giving a voice to all the stakeholders involved. In this third session, then, we will learn about the objectives and the dynamics of operations of the national entities in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, and the way in which their work help us for regulatory convergence. The use of the reliance depends of all the international or standardization organizations because of the role that they develop in working on all the international standards so that they could be used at local level. The trust of the regulators based on the decisions made by their peers is very effective when the regulatory frameworks have a common base in international standards. In order to achieve international standards in regulations, it doesn't mean that we're only going to comply with an international obligation that each country has, which even though that would be enough, this becomes even easier when there is trust by the regulators and the manufacturers on the criteria that was stipulated in the standards so as to guarantee the quality, the safeness, and the performance of medical devices. So after this introduction and understanding the objective of the session, I will now like to introduce our first panel member. He is Jorge Cajaseira. He has a PhD in management from the Sao Paulo Management School and the Foundation Tulio Vargas in Brazil. He is a worldwide president of the committee developing the ISO standards on responsibility and sustainable forests. He's currently a leader of ABNT, the Brazilian Association of Technical Standards, as well as a professor in the State University of Bahia. Jorge, welcome, and you have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Jorge, tu micrófono está silenciado.
I'll apologize for that. Sorry. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm trying to speak on behalf of ABNT about the situation of Brazil in terms of standardization in the process. Of course, it focuses in medical device. I will speak in Portuguese, of course, it's my language, and please switch to the translators to Spanish or English. It's better. Letícia, pode colocar os slides?
Leticia, could you please share my slides? Yes, I'm already doing that in a minute.
Perfect. O próximo, por favor.
Next one, please.
No se ve en presentación completa las diapositivas.
Acho melhor talvez assim mesmo. Às vezes passar os slides.
Maybe we could go on like this.
Vamos lá.
So, let me tell you a little bit about ABNT. ABNT is an organization that was founded in 1940, really consolidated. It used to be part, or it was part of the first global meeting that created ISO. So ABNT and ISO have been together since the beginning. ISO was founded in 1945 and ABNT was part of the foundation of ISO. It is a private organization. It is not a government organization. However, it is a nonprofit organization. It is the only national forum for standardization, the only one that the Brazilian government recognizes. We represent Brazil at ISO, IEC, COPAND, and AMN. And ABNT is, of course, responsible for the elaboration of the Brazilian standards, our NBRs. We also certified products, services, systems, and environmental labeling. We are signatory of the Code of Good Practices and Standardization from WTO. Basically, next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight that ABNT is part of the global context. Brazil is a country with a vast tradition in exporting. So this is why, for us, having a mutual understanding and a mutual recognition with with other countries, especially ISO, it is essential so Brazil can survive and exist in the global international trade market. I can only see the first slide. Maybe we should go to slide number 3 now. I apologize, we are having some technical difficulties. I believe that now it is working. It's fine the way it is. All right. This slide shows you how international ABNT is. Around 30% of the Brazilian standards are fully integrated with the ISO standards. In total, in Brazil, we have around 300,000 documents in our catalog, and that includes documents that in which we have a cooperation agreement with ANSI, for example, for pretty much all the South American bodies. At ABNT today, we have 232 technical committees, and all of them work based on international standards. Next slide, please. And this talks a little bit about a need that we have here at ABNT to adapt to an ever-changing world. In our understanding, the current global scenario related to trade is based on 4 major vectors: volatility. Things are unexpected, they're always surprised. Another vector would be uncertainty, complexity as well. There is a growing need to be connected to the world, and ambiguity. The relations are not always clear. For example, I would like to mention what happened with the COVID pandemic in the past 2 years, when the world had to quickly integrate for the vaccine, for the recommendation on masks, on respirators. There was this very strong need for all those elements, and standardization was essential. So the vaccines that came both from the US and Europe, for example, to Brazil, would be accepted by Anvisa. All this process was based on international standards and procedures. So the need to have this correlation with global standards is not a matter of choice anymore. It is a matter of survival for all exporting countries. This is a joke. If life gives you lemons, you have to make a lemonade. That's what we often say here in Brazil. Actually, we don't make a lemonade. We make caipirinha. We add a little bit of sugar and cachaça to make this wonderful cocktail. But the ingredients of this lemonade right now, they could be translated into this interconnection between simplifying our tactics, innovating on the processes, and participating more on the digital world. This is what we call resilience, our ability to adapt, and the ability of the Brazilian market to adapt based on international regulations. So adaptation and ability combined allow us to survive and exist in this ever-changing world. But what are the major challenges that ABNT faces in this exchange of standards and in keeping up with international standards? First, due to piracy and the fact that documents are available on PDF, our revenue has gone down, and the sales of standards have also gone down, which makes the engagement of the stakeholders more important, and also the understanding of the international trade practices. Our president has been trying to put Brazil in the leadership position at ISO, so we have an internationalization and an understanding of all the standards, basically the full standardization framework. It's not easy because in order to do that, you need experts that speak English, that can communicate well in a different language. But this is the strategy that our current president has adopted. And this is essential to understand the issue associated to medical devices. In Brazil, in 2020, there was a change after a presidential decree, Decree 10,229. And it states that in lack of a national standard, the ISO standard is valid. So basically it says few laws and more standards, more voluntary acceptance. This is the strategy of the federal government. They are searching for the acceptance of standards as to reduce the need for more legislation in Brazil. Brazil is a country with a lot of legislation, and the strategy for this is to increase the number of international standards accepted in the country. So, in summary, the guiding principles for the internationalization processes of ABNT is the strengthening of our technical committees, innovation on our products, the digital transformation, or the landmarks from ISO. For medicine, this is an important thing because virtual surgeries or remote surgical techniques will require a different type of standard. They will require a standard that is developed for machines. This is something that ABNT is looking at. And of course, the whole world is also looking at through ISO smart standards. We also search to increase our participation of all stakeholders. And of course, we try to integrate ISO and our operations with the technical committees. So these are the guiding principles of standardization in the current administration here at ABNT. In order to increase the speed of our practices, we have created a process called recommended practices. It basically allows standards to be created at a shorter period of time. So it's not longer acceptable to spend 3 or 4 years to get an international acceptance. We need to reduce that period. During the pandemic, for example, all the standards for the use of masks, the use of sanitizers, all those standards were created in a reduced time, of course, inspired by the international standards. And this is why this debate is so relevant. I apologize. Next one. And in conclusion, I would like to reassure you of our purpose. In global terms, we want to build trust. We want to have discipline and mutual understanding. This is why this is such an important forum for us. We want to foster dialogue and communication. Organizations do not become engaged with this. People are engaged in the process, so this is essential. And standards are essential to the benefit of our societies. And we believe that standards bring stability to this ever-changing world. And in conclusion, a little bit of a motto we have at ISO that we fully adopt in Brazil: one standard, one test, accepted everywhere. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Gran pantallazo sobre el trabajo de
Thank you for giving us that information on the work done by your group, ABNT, internationally, and your relationship with international organizations. Continuing with all of these presentations from Brazil, we will now introduce Humberto Tiburcio. He's the coordinator of the Grupo Mineiro de Calidad y Laboratorio. He's a manager at the GQNL laboratory, and he's also part of the Committee of Standardization CB36. So Humberto, welcome. You can go ahead and share your screen. And just to remind you, you have 10 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting ABNT CB36 to bring its contribution and how standardization is in our sector. Our sector is clinical analysis and products for in vitro diagnosis. We have a scope on ABNT, which is standardization related to requirements, terminology, methods in general. and everything related to management and quality assurance or procedures, analytical performance, safety in the lab, security of information, systems and reference materials, as well as equipment associated with our professional activity. Of course, associated with laboratories. ABNT CB36 is from 1998, and it is included in this same position that we just heard from Jorge. So it's one of the co-founders of ISO TC 212, ever since the beginning of ISO TC 212. And it's our international reference. So that's why this technical committee of ISO TC 212 is so important. I'm going to show you here something that is more related to what is, or at least what we are doing, or our attempt and success of what I'm going to say. I'm not going to talk about our failures because I know that people happen. So first I'm going to mention our success and what we were able to do and change on the proposal, making sure we have solutions for our challenges and not more challenges that are not solved. We have three major challenges in the new technical norm in Brazil related to the in vitro diagnosis challenge, whether it's labs or products. The first challenge is how to increase participation. So voluntary processes, few people. So in that case, there is a risk that that standard will be a reflex of not a lot of vision, which can be a bad thing. Another challenge that we have, and we are actually successful in facing it, is how to improve the content of these standards. There are standards that obviously everyone here knows that the content of a standard is the essence of the standard. So if we can't have improvements, content improvements for a standard, the chance of it not working and not being used is very big. It can be mandatory, but people may not follow it. What makes people follow a standard is not just that it is mandatory or voluntary, is what is the gain that they're going to have with the content of this standard? How are they going to apply that in their lab? And the third challenge that we face and we are successfully facing is balancing nationalization of ISO standards versus Brazilian standards. And this is a very important aspect because ISO standards have a totally separate process. And sometimes it demands more dedication from people, more commitment, specifically related to the date for votes, for manifestation. And at least for us in Brazil, the commitment. And people don't really like this kind of commitment here in Brazil. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what we did and what I can tell you that was a success and has been a success, and what is contributing to be able to solve these challenges that no longer exist. The first activity that we developed to be able to increase participation and increase the content and this balance between nationalization and Brazilian standards is the creation of a research mechanism, so an electronic research mechanism with the users of standards, so labs and manufacturers of either products or services. So far, we have had 3 rounds of research. The first round was about the urine test. That's why we developed a standard about that. And it's going to get to the last meeting soon. And it also involves a lot of products for in vitro diagnostics. And like in this case, the sanitation agency and also our own boards or professional boards. What is the success for this case is that we are able to know through a questionnaire, or actually 2 questionnaires, we're able to understand the opinion of over 400 labs of all states and what are, the provinces or even other countries. There wasn't one state that didn't have manifestation. So very small labs, sometimes even with 3 employees, and big labs with 2,000-3,000 employees. So this mechanism allowed for us to have better knowledge before the standard about process, procedure, validation, quality systems, quality management, and it gave a lot of substitute for this standard. To this end, we conducted 2 researches, and each one had more than 400 people. Then we did the same model, the same research model, but the content was actually different for the stool test analysis. Here in Brazil, one of the 5 tests that are more done in the country is the stool test, but we know that, we understood things that made us really worried about how trustworthy and how credible the results were from this analysis. And this week, we are finalizing this afternoon, this Sunday afternoon, we finished the first national research for the blood test, which is one of the most done in Brazil as well. And let's see what we will find. So your regular blood count. This was a way of proposing solutions for challenges that we had. The other way was bringing to ABNT this proposal that was accepted and was assigned. So there was a technical group that was created inside the technical council in ABNT. So the technical council in ABNT is an organ that has representations for all Brazilian committees. And we created a proposal that we would establish conditions to improve the participation of people on the study commissions. This is ongoing. This activity is ongoing, and soon enough, we will have ABNT offering to all Brazilian committees and everyone there conditions of recognizing this volunteer work. So recognition is important. It's not enough to thank or send an email or request contribution. We need more. We need to do more. If we want more people thinking, if we want us to have intelligence working towards normalization, standardization, we need to work on being reciprocate. So this is very important because we have this on our ABNT work group, which is preparing the retribution for everyone who participated. And we also had the opportunity of distributing it for everyone interested. And finally, we also have the strengthening of relationships with manufacturers. So among us, Letícia's case, which through a Brazilian entity here, the Brazilian Chamber of Laboratory Diagnosis, we started 2 works with nationalization of standards. One of them is ISO 15197, which is about the glucose. We have 11% of the Brazilian population made up of diabetic people, so it has a huge impact. These are our activities favoring standardization, getting closer to being useful for people, answering the demand of regulators, but also they need to provide security to our patients. So that is the contribution that I wanted to bring today from the ABNT CB 36 point of view. Someone asked a question here, but I didn't do the presentation of what I wanted, but I can send it if you want. I didn't have a presentation.
Por esta presentación y introducirnos al trabajo del Comité Técnico.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for introducing all the technical work of the ABNT committee has done. I remind you that if you have any questions for the panel members, please use the Q&A tool that you have on the bottom of your screen. There's actually one question now that I believe several of you could answer in writing because it's quite long. So I think that you can answer right there. So now we are going to go into Colombia. And from Colombia, we have Andrés Hernandez. He's a physician. He is the leader for standardization on the health, science, technology, and innovation sector at Incontec, which is the standardization entity from Colombia. And he's also participant of ISO committees for medical devices and biotechnology and health, among others. Based on your curricula, Andres, I think that you would be the best person to answer the question that they're asking regarding standards for medical devices like syringes, gloves, and other biomedical equipment, and what could be the international references for that, the ISO references for that. You have 10 minutes once again, and good morning. Thank you. Welcome everybody to be here, and thank you for inviting me for this presentation and for inviting Colombia to talk about this technical standardization. Now, regarding the question very briefly, there are international technical standards in each country depending on the exact question that they have. They have to go to their standardization organization. They might find the ISO ASTM standard or the standard for in their own language. They're all divided based on the criteria, the search criteria, and it's very easy to find this. You just use the ISS code, which is for international reference for all the products and medical devices, and that's where you can find the subclassification. Also, in the Incontec website, as well as with other organizations, we have this with under the search criteria of medical devices, and there you have all the different standards that are available for the same. So in these 10 minutes, I'm going to introduce how we are analyzing the impact of the technical standards in the health sector. This is a little bit related to the concept of medical devices, basically. And just as an introduction, Incontec is the National Standardization Organization of Colombia, which is authorized under National Decree 1595, dated 2015. We have technical standards and over 200 technical committees. And so that is our lifeline, why we are here. We're also part of the quality subsystem, which is a network of Colombian institutions and organizations that have been set up and have been interrelated or working together to find out and talk about the infrastructure of quality with different approaches and different topics. And the committee, my committee as a standardization organization, is part of this committee. Regarding the technical standardization, as I said, we are part of over 200 technical committees, and I included some of the committees that are the most important ones right here in the health sector. They somehow have an impact on the context of medical devices. We have the one for medical devices, sterilization, disinfectants, biotechnology, safety, health management, IT, and clinical labs. And I also included who is chairing each one of these committees. And I included this so that you would see how, from the technical standardization point of view, we wanted to keep and guarantee a balance and an equality of conditions for all the different actors that participate in the standardization process. Now, it's also important to highlight that some of these technical standardization committees have international participation, like full members of ISO. And in the case of IT in health, we are also members as observers in the IT in health committee. the diversity of all the stakeholders, the multilaterally that we have, and the conversation of all the different parties really lead us to recognize and to have a process for developing the standards that is really very detailed and very specific depending on the needs of the different stakeholders. Now here in this standardization process, I want to highlight how it is related with society, and because that's the communication that we have with the stakeholders so that we can analyze its feasibility. These first phases, which is phase 1 and phase 2, correspond to that opening door so that we can start with the technical standardization process inside of Econtec, considering different variables that are very important for us. First of all, we have this need of having a technical standard by the consumers, the government, agencies, society, entities, companies, or private or public organizations, or even by the academic side. So that based on their information, we can do a feasibility study, see if it's viable in a strategy and how that standardization need is aligned with a technical standard that we could develop. Now we have developed the eConnecta platform. This is a standardization platform that really allows users and all participants to have timely and real information of the standardization process itself. And the most important thing here is that we have an interactive participation so that users and all interested parties can directly communicate with us, and so that we can allow for this bilateral communication, guaranteeing the active participation in our standardization process. This platform includes all sectors. The health sector obviously has also a microsite there where we can have all the information presented of what is happening regarding technical standardization. Now, regarding what happens with technical standards for medical devices and health technologies, well, as I said at the beginning, we do that, and our process follows the needs of the sector, the feasibility that for us, means that it's actually feasible and we can develop a standard document, and for those needs to be external also. So that means that whenever we receive a standard request from different companies, manufacturers, or marketers, the government that plays a very important role in this, when they request these type of technical standards for regulation, that is what really happens with the communication that we have with the regulatory organization in Colombia, which is the health ministry. And we also participate in the development of all of these standards documents, and we've made a sub-classification because of the large size of all the medical devices area, so that we could really cover and include everything that is related to medical devices. So I would like to highlight here that we have certain work done in the biomedical products. We have other hospital use products also that, based on the national regulations, are not considered medical devices, but that are being used at the hospitals. We also have in health technologies, we have everything related to software also, because sometimes it's not considered as a medical device, but here we have a difference. And regarding service providers, health service providers, we have all the concepts regarding biotechnology, the in vitro diagnosis reagents, and very recently, the role that we want to get is to have and include this concept of biobanks, to include all the technology and all the medical devices that are related to the health sector. We currently have over 400 technical standards published for the medical devices criteria. Our participation in Colombian regulations, well, is that we've really set the path, and we've tried to promote the use of all the technical standards with some conditions and with some adjustments that, as time has gone by, we have been able to give some regulatory support through standardization to all of these. Regarding medical devices, we want to have an adoption, identical adoption to those international standards, which opens the door to all the different standards because we are developing these that are identical to the reference document or the international organizations. And that way we can guarantee that equivalent in the translation into Spanish and in all the technical requirements. We've also participated in international committees for biotechnology, clinical labs, or medical devices, allows the committees to have updated information and allows them to participate from the moment they are building the international standard to the moment of their development. So that's why the path has been so much short whenever Colombia started with the international process, because Colombia had already been participating in all of these committees in the development of the document itself. There's also interaction with the government, the industry, the academic area, with our technical committees, and this translates in having opportunities to have a good answer to our regulatory standards to make sure that they could be applicable. And we've also seen another important benefit in all the national domestic manufacturers because the markets have been globalized by using this international technical standards. As one of the cases of success, or maybe some of the best practices that we've had in the development of regulatory documents, is that the main thing is that we have that interaction between all the technical committees and how the different stakeholders get involved and participate together with the government. And whenever that happens, there is a convergence point in the communication between the needs of the sector of the industry and the needs in the framework of medical devices for the government. That is how we've made some very important progress. To date, we already have adopted all of these documents in different fields, like the ones that are mentioned there. And these mechanical ventilators has been very important for us. We also have some related to point of care testing and also the regulations for assays and tests. That's very important in case of the regulatory agency. So just to wrap this up, I mean, in the case of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, the INCONTEC, because of its social responsibility role, included in its website a list of all the technical standards regarding medical devices and in vitro diagnosis reagents. This was done so as to support all the industry, to support all the health providers, and so as to make some progress in the use of the these technical standards, so that we can globalize, have some safety for the patient, and so that we can have a homologation of all the medical devices. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Andres, for this presentation. And we have a couple of questions here that are a little bit related to what you talked about, but it's also related to what the other presenters are going to talk about. So Edna Karime says, thank you. I work in a regulatory entity in Colombia called INVIMA, and I know the management of the standards that INCOTEC has, but I would like to hear about the other countries, what they do. We heard Brazil already, but now we're going to hear Mexico and Peru. And then Luis Eduardo Castañeda says, good morning. Regarding the adoption of international standards for software considered medical devices, what kind of standards have you created for this purpose? Or I don't know if you can answer that, or it could be answered afterwards. If you agree, let's continue. And at the end, we see if somebody else talks about this. We have the IT committee with several documents. The most important one is the one that has to do with telemedicine, ISO 131, that's already available in Colombia. And I think that we have over 20 documents related to IT in health that specifically talk about software. Right, thank you very much. Well, now we're going to go to Mexico. And for that, we're going to introduce, firstly, Emeterio Mozo. He is an engineer, has a bachelor's in telecommunications from the National Institute of Monterrey. He has expertise in standardization and has represented the country in several international forums like ISO and Food Codex and others. He's coordinating all the work of conformity in Mexico, and he is the liaison of the National Standard Direction with the Office of Foreign Trade of the Ministry of Economy. He's currently in charge of light manufacturing in the standards area of the Ministry of Economy. So go ahead, Emeterio. Thank you very much, Cody. And good morning, everybody. For me, it is an honor to be here in this work session where we can exchange the point of views of all the regulators and those who develop the standards or the technical standards. So Sandra, if you could show my presentation, please. If not, I can go ahead and do it. Just 1 second.
Perfecto. Muy bien. Mientras voy comentando.
So, the Federal Standards Direction is the regulatory body, and we also create some standards sometimes. And in this case, the powers that we have to develop technical standards or official technical standards, as they are called in Mexico, or norms, have the objective of safekeeping human health and of protecting health, as well as covering legitimate objectives for public interest. We have a new law for quality infrastructure that allows us to harmonize with all international standards, as has been mentioned by our colleagues from Brazil and Colombia. The harmonization is the base for the creation of standards. And in this case, in our direction, it is the base for the creation of technical standards. Now, in this presentation, we have a very quick agenda because we wanted to show you the legal framework of the same. Thank you, Sandra. So this is the title of this, and this is the agenda. And here I'm going to talk about 6 main points. We're going to talk about the legal framework, international harmonization, who are the standardization authorities that have the power to develop technical regulations, and what standards do we have for medical devices, currently have for medical devices. And I'm also going to talk about a new proposal for an official standard for electromedical equipment. In the part of Mexico, we also have Luis Ivan, and he's going to be presenting more information regarding how to develop and work on the standard. So I'm going to focus more on technical regulations or Mexican official standards or norms. So let's go to the next one. As you know, the legal framework, because of this international increase in the exchange of merchandise, it represents that we need to have harmonized custom systems so as to facilitate international trade. Mexico, through the custom systems, identifies, audits, verifies, and controls the entry and exit of all of these products. The countries also have the right of applying the necessary measures to reach these objectives that are of public interest. As we know, the regulators in each country issue these to protect health, protect the environment, and to benefit also the free trade, the trade of merchandise. So through these standards, the norm as norms in Spanish, establish the technical regulations and the safety and quality requirements that are minimum that both domestic and international producers need to comply with. And the infrastructure, the quality infrastructure law, as I mentioned, was published in 2020 and was already enforced. We are now in the phase of redacting the regulations for this law. And in Article 64 establishes a mandate that says that when a product or service has to comply with an official Mexican standard, the similars that will be imported should also follow through with those specifications. And they should show their compliance at the entry point in the country. So it's very relevant because when this technical standard starts harmonizing with international standards or foreign standards, then the trade of these merchandise can be benefited. Now, the foreign trade law for Mexico stipulates also specific rules to identify all the tariffs of different fractions to identify what official Mexican standard has to be followed through before their entry into the country. And the Ministry of the Economy has also determined the level of risk and what Mexican official standards need to be complied at the point of entry of the country. So this is one of the points of the law that places the level of risk so that they can identify what Mexican standards need to be requested before they, or at the point of entry of the country. We have around 600 of them, and only 80 are demanded or requested at the point of entry in the country. So as you can see, there is a vast array of those standards that are still not requested at the point of entry of the country. But this also has to do with having the necessary infrastructure to assess the feasibility and to give certainty to all importers in Mexico. So here I'm going to talk about what the law for quality infrastructure in Mexico is stipulating. We've already heard how Brazil and Colombia have done a lot of work in international committees so that they can harmonize all of those with their technical standards. And in this case, Mexico does the same. It's no exception. We work with the same idea. And the law for quality infrastructure stipulates that we can even have equivalent agreements or mutual acknowledgement agreements, or we can approve or execute these agreements with other standardization authorities, including conformity assessment organizations. So the law stipulates that we can acknowledge them in this way. The law also stipulates that we need to participate, that each regulatory or standardization organization needs to participate in their own area. This is quite important because it means the government of Mexico to what type of international organization is going to recognize, is Mexico going to recognize? This is very important because then it's very important to differentiate between that international organizations or what would be considered a foreign organization from the point of view of Mexico. Also, the standardization organizations that do these technical documents need to ensure that they have public policies that would contribute to the national infrastructure system in Mexico. And also, it says that it's important to participate in their environment and developing international standards. The ministry could also present an opinion in these international standards. We have a Mexican committee that is attending the ISO, and to that regards, we are organizing the National Standardization Organization based on the new law, as well as any stakeholder or any people with the power to create the standardization so that they can participate in the work done by the ISO. Mexico was one of the founding members of several organizations during the 40s. And by law, we also need to observe this code of good conduct that has also been mentioned in this work session so that we can consider this agreement regarding technical barriers to trade of the WTO and to benefit technical regulations and the standards during their issuance so as to facilitate international trade. So as you know, as you can see, the infrastructure law is considering international work and all its harmonization, not only the adoption of international standards, but their participation in those international standards. Now going to the next slide. Here, I'm going to talk about the standardization authorities that develop technical regulations. We have 22 different entities. We have the Ministry of the Economy, which is the main one that is heading the quality infrastructure system. And we also have other standardization agencies like Senacica, the Environmental Ministry, Tourism Secretary, the Navy, and COFEPRIS. COFEPRIS is a regulatory agency in Mexico that is in charge of developing all the technical documents that specifically are related to medical devices. So as you can see, there are several regulatory authorities, and based on a risk analysis and an analysis to protect the legal objectives for public interest of Mexico, they issue these regulations. And as you can see, the law says that they need to be harmonized with international standards. Now I'm going to go specifically to show you what are these Mexican official standards for Mexican devices that we currently have. We currently have two of these norms that have been issued by COFEPRIS, which is the Federal Commission for the Protection Against Sanitary or Health Risks. In this case, we have NOM 137 that talks about the labeling of medical devices. This official standard was developed in 2008 and states, based on international standards, that they are harmonized with the EN 980 of graphical symbols for the use in the labeling of medical devices. So it's harmonized with that one. It also says that in time, we need to review these technical regulations. And so the authorities at that moment should update the information based on the technology or the creation of new international standards as necessary. On the other side, we have NOM 241 that has also been issued by this regulatory agency that has to do with best manufacturing practices for medical devices. And that is in agreement with all these international standards. It says which of them are partially agreed with, for like the ISO 13485, as well as ISO 14969. And these actually, the second one was removed and is no longer available. So then the standardization organization needs to consider those that they have been limited internationally, and so they have to consider that. This has to do with the manufacturing process of medical devices, and so they need to take an approach of the quality management aspect, But the standardization organization is the COFEPRIS and not the Ministry of the Economy. Now here, I'm going to talk about what the Ministry of the Economy is doing. So in this case, I wanted to show you that we are reviewing a proposal for a Mexican standard for electromedical equipment. This came in the different work groups because of a modification in the standard 03 that has to do with electrical safety standards. And in that work group, they expressed the need to develop this standard for electromedical equipment specifically. We take into consideration the standards, the NMX, the NICE, and the ANSE ones, that they have a level of concordance with the IEC 6601, Part 1 and Part 2, as well as with the 6601-219. And there's two authorities or bodies that are working here. One is the General Standardization Direction and the COFEPRIS. And so in conclusions, we currently don't have a standard at the Ministry of the Economy that regulates electric and electronic safety of medical devices, which is why this is going to be assessed between the two authorities in the days to come. Normally, at the entry point to the country, they request a compliance with the standards. With standard 001 talks about electronic devices as a whole and not specifically of medical devices. So the Ministry of the Economy has shown the interest of working together with the COFEPRIS so that they can issue this standard and guarantee the safety of the worker in the health sector and of the patient itself. And there's also a collaboration between Mexico and Germany to review all the electromedical devices so to prevent any technical barriers to trade. Now, we are proposing that they're going to be named electromedical devices. So with this, that's the end of my presentation. And I'm here if you have any comments. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emeterio, for your presentation and for introducing the way in which quality infrastructure works in Mexico and how this new law is going to be working. Now, you have a question right here from Pilar. I have a question for Dr. Emeterio. What does it mean to have a partial degree of matching with a standard 241 with ISO 13485, that it's just partially matching? I don't know if you want to answer here or in writing. Well, thank you, Cory, and thank you, Sophia, for this question. It's a modified degree of matching versus the ISO standard that established the international degree of matching. So in that level, we need to identify the technical deviations. But since this standard, the NOM 137, is dated 2008, in the previous law, we didn't stipulate the level of matching that it had to have, but it has to do with this international service of identifying the technical deviations. So that's why it's not identical. That's a deviation. Thank you very much, Emeterio. Okay, so now we will continue with Mexico, and I'm going to introduce Luis Ivan Hernandez Becerril. He's an electric engineer from the National Polytechnical Institute and specialized in power devices. He has diplomas in regulations and standardization. He has many 20 years of experience internationally and domestically in the development of standards. And he's currently working in the ANCE as the director for standardization. Luis Ivan is also a member of the Executive Committee of Cadena, which is the Harmonization Council for all technical standards of the Americas. He's also part of FINCA, which is the forum for international committees related to IEC in the Americas. He's also part of the focal group for COPAN and a sub-coordinator of the Technical Committee 152 on energy efficiency and renewable energy of COPAN. Luis Ivan has also participated internationally as a member of the direct maintenance team of the IEC and also member of the joint directly maintenance team of the IEC and ISO together. So Luis Ivan, go ahead, you have 10 minutes. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Cody. Before anything, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate ANSYS experience regarding the standardization of electrical equipment for medical use. It's important to say that in this presentation, we're going to see this as electrical equipment for medical use. And if we talk about this in the national context, that's basically the supplement for medical devices of the Mexican Pharmacopoeia. These were basically all the medical devices, the active medical devices. So just to talk about the national context and how we use it in international context, that is what we're going to refer to. It's important to talk about the activities that each one of the stakeholders in the region carries out. And specifically in Mexico, we need to talk about how the regulations are worked on, as we've already seen throughout Emeterio's presentation. I am going to focus on the technical standards as well as the participation in international standardization organizations or activities. So for this presentation, and considering that we have a reduced amount of time, we're going to talk about these topics. We're going to talk about the quality infrastructure law. Emeterio already mentioned it, but I think that it's important to mention, especially for those that understand the domestic context, that we had a different law on the methodology, and now we're going to be working with the quality infrastructure law. And this is basically the legal framework we have in Mexico for standardization activities, as well as for all the activities in international framework. Everything happens under the law, quality infrastructure law that was issued in 2020. Then we're going to talk about the activities that we do in ANSE regarding Mexico standards. This is one of the main things that we work together with the DGN, where we previously called the Mexican standards, the technical standards that were developed by private organizations. But now with this quality infrastructure law, all of them are going to call standards. They're not going to have any distinction. But currently in ANSE, we're still developing Mexican standards, and we're going to continue doing so until we have the registry and the information from the organizations and the corresponding organizations to work in a general standard. And then we're going to talk about the regulatory framework that we're using in Mexico based on technical standards. That is basically what Emeterio mentioned of a new proposal that we have for electrical equipment for medical use. And we're going to talk about the standards that are being used as a base. And also, as Emeterio mentioned, we could create a Mexican standard, official standard that is based on this proposal. Now, firstly, and for all of those who don't know who ANSE is a national standardization organization. We have a test laboratory where we assess the electromagnetic compatibility requirements for these devices for medical use. We also analyze electrical devices and other type of devices. And we are also an authorized third party by COFEPRIS regarding medical devices. And this is provided in the environment of other services. As I was saying, in June of 2020, they published the Quality Infrastructure Law that is the new law. Based on this law, this is a set of initiative processes, institutions, regulatory authorities, standardization authorities, and all the people who interact themselves to develop the standards. These develop a legal framework, and all the authors or all the stakeholders that are interested can participate so that they can cover everything related to public interest and to prosper and drive economic development in our country. This establishes all the basis for the national standardization system that has as an objective to achieve the health of the Mexican population. So that's why they develop the standardization, they do the assessment of conformity, they do the methodology and everything related to it. It's important to say that based on what has been established in this law, when we talk about standardization, we are basically referring to the development of technical regulations. And when we talk about standardization, in Spanish, we have two words. One, when we talk about, the first one was normalization, and then we talk about the technical developments. And when we talk about standardization, we talk about the technical standards that have been developed by the private organizations. So it's important that in Spanish, we have two different concepts. One is normalization, the other one is standardization. And it's important to mention them because they are part of this new quality infrastructure law. So when we talk about normalization, we are talking about technical documents. And when we talk about standardization, we are basically talking about technical standards developed by private entities. Another important thing to say is that this law is in agreement with the WTO standards and in the part of standardization related to Annex 3 of this agreement with the Code of Good Conduct for the application of standards. For example, they established that they shouldn't develop regulations or standards. They should always develop them, and whenever it's possible, these regulations or standards should take into consideration international standards of ISO or IEC. Just as with this law also stipulates that regulations and standards need to be harmonized with international standards. And for that, they need to create Mexican committees so that they can follow through with the international standards. To date, we have two. One is the SEM, that's the Electromechanical Committee that works with the IEC, and the other one is the ISO committee that Emeterio mentioned in his presentation, and that also talks about all the topics related to this. As ANSE, we're working in both the IEC Mexican Committee as in the ISO Mexican Committee. Now, this is the first one, and here we're talking about normalization. As you see, this is the definition that we have in Mexico for the Mexican official standards. And when we talk about these norms in Mexico, I want you to understand that we're always talking about technical regulations, a document developed by the government or by the regulatory authorities in Mexico, and that is compulsory. Who develops this document? As Emeterio said, all the normalizing authorities. And for the topic that we're talking about today, these are the activities that COFEPRIS does. You know, they are managing this National Standardization Committee that developed the standards for good practices manufacturing of medical devices standards. And so now go into standardization. These are the activities that we carry out here at ANSE. We basically have a definition based with the Quality Infrastructure Law, which is a standard, a technical document that considers the common use and repeating the rules, specifications, attributes of testing methods applicable to a good, a product, a process, or service, as well as those regarding terminology, symbology, packaging, marking, labeling, and its matching. For those that know the national system, this were recognized as technical standards. But today, based on the quality infrastructure law, they're only going to be called standards. And the international context, I think it's important to say that these documents are known as technical standards. So after developing these standards, basically the quality infrastructure law is stipulating these options. We have standards that could be developed by national standardization organizations known as ONE, or legal entities that have an interest in this, or by a standardization authority.
Aparentemente perdimos a Luis. Ah, sí, se desconectó. Sandra, yo creo que le damos unos segundos.
I'm sorry, we apologize. I think we lost him,
Sí, sí, te saliste.
but now he's back.
Un segundo, vuelvo a poner la presentación. Estaba en esta diapositiva, íbamos hasta ahí en la
Sí, sí.
presentación. Ok, perfecto. Bueno, les comentaba, estos son los
So
tres
as I was saying, these are the three bodies that could develop standards. We have the National Standardization Organization, any legal entity that has an interest, and the normalizing authority. It's important to say that we currently in Mexico don't have national standardization organizations. We're still working with the national normalization organizations, and they're basically focused on the development of the official
seguramente pronto tendremos
Mexican standards or the norms. So this is what is considered in the law. And as I said, this is how it's going to be developed in the future and with people that could develop the new standards. This is probably going to be stipulated in the law of quality infrastructure that is being in the regulations for the same that is being worked together with the General Direction of Standards through the Ministry of the Economy.
Este es el proceso que se tiene en México.
So this is the process we follow in Mexico to develop new standards. It's basically matching what we currently have for the development of Mexican standards or the norms. And what is established here is that they have to create a committee that is formed by all the different stakeholders that are going to be benefited by the development of a document or that could have an impact on the development of the same. I don't want to stop in this process because it's just a process that is following the international processes for the development of technical standards, where we basically establish you have to have a proposal, it has to be sent for public consultation before the final document is published. We need to cover all the documents that were received during the public consultation, but I leave the process right here in the presentation so that you can be familiar with it. Now, specifically talking about the activities that we have in ANSE, to date, we are still developing technical standards or the CNNX as we know them. And for the development of the documents based on the federal law, we require to have a committee that is formed by all the different sectors of society. So in this slide, I'm showing the different institutions that are part of these committees and that are in charge of developing all the technical standards for the electrical sector and for including the electrical medical use devices. It's important to mention this one because this gives us the entrance to international participation. Those who are developing the Mexican standards are the same people who are participating internationally. This is in the development of the ISO standards and the IEC standards. And based on this presentation, we want to highlight this next slide because our participation in IEC means that we are participating in 32 committees, 30 subcommittees, and one IT committee for the IEC. In this participation, we're also participating in technical committee 52 of electrical equipment for medical practice. And here we basically develop all the IEC standards that have to do with electrical equipment for medical use. We basically we're talking about the 6601 standard that are basically the standards that we follow and adopt in ANSA for these type of products for all the electrical equipment for medical use. And in ANSA, we currently have around 1,000 standards, and of those, 450 of them take as a base the documents developed by the IEC. And of those 450 standards, we include those that have to do with electrical equipment for medical use. Now, regarding ISO, well, we have a participation in 6 committees and 2 subcommittees. And here the highlight is our participation in Technical Committee 210, which is basically the part developing everything regarding medical devices in ISO. Now, to the 1,000 standards we have in NANSE, around 100 of them are considering the ISO standards as a base. And regarding another international participation, I wanted to say that in IEC, we are participating in technical committee number 62. The number of standards and publications that we have here in IEC are very extensive. We're talking about over 300 standards developed with electrical equipment for medical use, biotechnologies, etc. So we have a vast number of documents to start working on them internationally. Regarding ISO, our participation, as I said, is basically on Technical Committee 210. And this committee has over 30 international standards, if I remember correctly, that have been taken as a base for the development of our standards. So here what I was mentioned is that we have to create the national committees, and these committees are going to also cover international participation. And for that, we created the committees nationwide. In the case of IEC, we have the technical committee, Mexican Technical Committee, where we have all the participants of the electrical sector in Mexico. And through this committee, we are participating in the activities of the Technical Committee 62, which is electrical equipment for medical use. In the ISO, we also have a technical committee to cover everything that comes from the ISO, as Emeterio mentioned in his presentation. And this one is headed by the standards direction. And our participation is related to Technical Committee 210. Now, regarding the regulation based on standards, as Emeterio mentioned, our regulation is establishing the requirements and uses the standards as a means to insert this regulation. An example is NOM 003 that refers to basically more than 100 ANSES standards, and these standards are being updated constantly based on the corresponding IEC or ISO standard. So this means that the regulation in Mexico by the use of the other standards allow us to have the new technology of the products to be considered and to update these documents or these Mexican standards whenever necessary, or developing new standards as required. As I said, in the development of these NOM 003 that is now being developed, they talked about the possibility of having a new official Mexican standard for equipment for medical use. So we're working on the development of those standards so that we can include it for medical devices and to present them and have them available for everybody. So basically, this is my presentation, Cory. Thank you very much, and I'm ready for any questions they might have. Thank you, Luis Ivan, for this presentation. I know that they already mentioned this, both you and Emeterio, but just to be clear, because you are the only ones that have that differences between normalization and standards. In Mexico, the norms are the Mexican compulsory standards that became the technical regulations, based on the agreement that we have of the WTO. And when we talk about standards in Mexico, those are the voluntary rules. This is just for the other countries to understand the information that they just received, of all the work that is being done in Mexico. So thank you very much. I see Emeterio has been answering a lot of questions. And there is one question that we're going to have and present at the end, because I think that you all have something to say about that. Now, in order to finish with this session of presentations, we're going to go to the last presentation. This is from Peru. And we're going to introduce Soraya Lastra, who is currently a planning executive for project manager and information center of the National Institute for Quality, which is INACAL in Peru. She has a degree in engineering from the National University of Mayor de San Marcos and has 15 years of experience in standardization. And she has represented the organization in different international and national forums for standardization. During the pandemic, she took the job of the technical subcommittee for standardization for preventive actions and work control that provides a guide with practical information for the protection of workers in their place of work because of the COVID-19 pandemic, so as to minimize the risk of spreading and getting sick with this disease in their place of work. So Soraya, thank you, and you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much, Cody. I want to thank the Inter-American Coalition first for this opportunity, for allowing us to share the work that we're all doing in the health sector, specifically when we talk about medical devices. Very interesting to see the presentations and see how each country is doing their own efforts based on their own perspectives and contributing to the sector. So now I want to share what we are doing as part of the Quality Institute INACAL in Peru. We are the guiding entity or the maximum authority for the quality system in Peru. This was born because there was a need to have this policy for quality. Now, regarding quality infrastructure topics, we've had those in Peru for many years, since the 60s, but we didn't have a national policy that talked about the quality specifically. And so that came about as of 2015 when this policy was approved, because it's very important, because even though there's always been tools for quality infrastructure topics, it's important to have this framework where the country is saying, okay, I commit to produce with this quality. No, I commit to the quality because I know it's important for the development of the country. And here in these environments, well, what we have to do is that we develop and have the competitiveness of economic activities, and we also protect the consumers. So based on this, in this policy, INACAL is the guiding body that will execute this quality infrastructure law and will manage the system. So INACAL has three main tools. It has the standardization direction, the accreditation direction, the metrology direction. And in our case, we want to talk about the first one, which is normalization, which is a voluntary framework. We approve the technical Peruvian standards always in the voluntary framework. We are the representatives in the ISO and IEC international organizations. And we also have some technical committees or a part of these technical committees in these coordinations. Now, the regulatory aspect is in charge of each competent authority, and those are called technical regulations or technical rules. You know, something similar to what we have here. And I think that the difference that we might have, or that INACAL might have with this quality infrastructure law, is that we have a direction for the strategic development of quality. This is what includes the three quality tools and see the interactions that they have. They actually are trying to offer all the competent authorities, the interested parties, the productive chains, solutions by using the quality infrastructure tool. However, each direction is autonomous, you know, by law. Each one of them has to be autonomous. They offer their services autonomously, and they offer them their services impartially. But this direction of strategic development is very important, because that is what was missing, you know, to get this whole view of where and in what topics could we participate regarding quality infrastructure as a whole. And so we consider that this is very important. How is it that we develop the technical standards? Well, it's very similar to how other organizations do this. We have the technical normalization committees. For us, what is normal is to look for a ministry that will assume the work of those technical committees or their coordination, because INACAL has over 200 committees and subcommittees that have been created. So the expertise, I mean, you do require very specific expertise in each one of the topics. So we're looking for those ministries that don't have any specific benefit but that will assume the role of coordinating those technical committees, as part of their projects. The committees have to be made up of members of the producing system, consumers, the state, and also the technical aspect, the universities, academicians, and other institutes for research and development. We comply with the good practices, the best practices code established by the ISO, by the Andean Association also. And we also follow the technical barriers to trade document. INACAL follows an assessment process, a constant assessment process, because we have ISO certifications, the ISO 9001, and others that we have identified in the organization. And we also have an impact and accreditation by the Canadian Council. So means that the INACAL has to follow through the agreement on technical obstacles to trade. It's very important to follow on that. And for us, we're going to renew this year. So that's very important. Just as many other organizations that we've heard before, we went through a public discussion process. We published the announcement of an official rules or regulations to present this document and to make all the different entities participant in this. And we have a collegiate body that is formed by a different people, but that is also formed by people in standardization areas that knows all the Peruvian standards. And then once we have the consensus of all of them, this is published in the official gazette. And regarding the international organization, well, as I said, we are members of ISO since 2007, and our director has been member of the ISO Council up to this year, and we are representatives in that organization. Regarding health aspects, we are working in the Health Informatics Committee, in occupational health, nanotechnology, and sterilization of health products. And this is done through the 79 mirror committees in which we are participating. So this gives us some benefits as all. I mean, one of the main benefits is to have all the catalog of the ISO standards to work on the normalization and to be able to offer at a country level the documents that are being identified as important. So this is how we are organized in the health aspect. In equipment, we have materials for medical devices, and we have for that the Technology Committee for Healthcare that includes packages for healthcare, medical materials, absorbing products for personal hygiene, devices and medical equipment and devices. So we have in total 98 technical standards. The ministries of this committee are in the health area through the Chamber of Commerce in Lima that works a lot in the health sector. And here we highlighted some of the members of these committees. There are some members of the public sector so that you can see that there is quite an interest, and we've always had conversations with the Inter-American Commission. They always talked about our relationship with the public sector. And we have here communication with them, but it's also a sector that is also highly occupied because of the environment that they work on, and that has been increasing because of the pandemic. And I'm going to take advantage of this space to answer to some of the questions that they had in the chat. They were asking if we had the ones that asked about the standards on syringes and I think gloves also. And in these standards, we have ISO adopted standards. And if we adopt these standards, if we adopt the ISO standards, as I said, we have a lot of them that has to do with medical devices that are adopted as the ISO standards, and we follow the process that we have in our own regulations, but we adopt the ISO standards and we recognize them very easily because we identify them based on the ISO code. And it's very easy. You know, if you can see in the first column, we have several of these ISO standards adopted for catheters, other type of standards here with they're all listed. And so we have several of them, as I said, and there are others that are equivalent, that are identical to ASTM standards, for example, like the one for the aging of medical devices is an equivalent standard of the ASTM. And you can clearly identify that because in the main page, it says that it is equivalent to the ASTM standard. It's an agreement that we have with them for many years. We need to identify all of them, and that's how we comply with that. So we adopted ISO standards. We use also ASTM equivalent standards that are pertinent or that should be necessary that we need to work on. So that's all I wanted to talk about. We also have the adoption of the IEC standards for electrical equipment, and they work with several parts, for example, that talks about the safety and functioning of incubators, or also for the use, safe use of the mammography devices. There was another question and a concern regarding IT topics about the technical standards that we had on this aspect. And I wanted to tell you that I lost now the screen, but as I showed in the prior slide, we are members of the Health IT Committee, Health and Informatics Committee, and everything that we've adopted come from this ISO committee. We did a new round adopting standards on health, patient health, and also we've seen others regarding electronic devices because that's of quite interest of the health sector. You know, sometimes it's very important to document those things that are important for the patients, and we need to file them because sometimes the packages, because of the indications that it has, it's not easy to identify. And so we are working with that with the committee, and they're following through with the adoption of these ISO standards. And I also want to talk about the work that we've done because of COVID-19 pandemic. As all of us, I mean, this is something that took us by surprise, but the reaction that we had here in the organization was very quick. We developed a procedure to approve these standards based on exceptions and based on an accelerated procedure because the pandemic was asking us to do so. We worked very closely with the health ministry, with the universities that have schools of medicine, with the necessary authorities. And as I said at the beginning, this committee, this committees assume an identity that is non-for-profit. And because of the seriousness of the topic, we also involved members of the health sector. So that way we had committees for intubating and extubating, for lung ventilators, for face masks and protectors, for bags for the transportation of bodies, for body bags, I'm sorry, and the measures for the prevention for going back to work, which we are working on that, as well as the use of UV lights for disinfection. It's something we've also seen what the ISO is developing. We haven't we adopt those, but we haven't published them yet. So we're going to also adopt the one for returning to work, what ISO said regarding the guidelines and the measures that they have. And this corresponds to the supreme mandate that the health ministry developed because of the pandemic, which was like a guideline on how to apply or how to use this or do this return to work safely. So I just wanted to tell you that I think that this has been quietly used by all of us when we talk about face masks, surgical masks. I'll leave you the information there. We are currently going back to school. And for that, we're carrying out different events with the educational sector to teach teachers, professors, and students about the right use of the face mask and about washing their hands constantly, how they have to do it. It's very important because for 2 years, not all of them went back to school. They had a partial return to school last year, but this year everybody's going back to school face to face. So that's where we have all the information there for our face mask standards. And regarding the health emergency, we published 36 technical standards that had to do with issues on how to cover any medical issues of the pandemic. And we worked very quickly with this process. In the past, we normally did it with everybody else. We did it face to face and it took a little bit longer, but now everything, all the committees are meeting virtually and we had to adapt to these changes. We have been able to be very successful on that. And the most important thing is that we have been able to carry out virtual events reaching 2,400 people in different regions of the country. And before we had to do this face to face. So we had also a series of webinars that specifically talked about the pandemic and that has helped us a lot. This is something else that we had produced through media news with these brochures and in this type of format so that everybody could have the information and so that it could be better understood by everybody. And I want to share the virtual platforms or websites that we have. We still have the Normas Libres website open, and all the documents regarding the pandemic are included here. And we also have the platform of the virtual reading room, because here we did the review. Once we reviewed this to the public, we were able to have a limited first enrollment of 3 days to see all the technical Peruvian standards. It doesn't include the ISO or those that have to do with consumer protection policies or intellectual property policies, but they can now read them here free of charge. So these are the links of interest. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm here if you need anything. So Soraya, thank you very much for this presentation. It's been quite interesting. And I'm glad that you mentioned the work that INACAL did as a response to the health emergency during the pandemic, because all the national standardization and regulation bodies had to respond very quickly to this. Some developed emergency standards or have worked together with them. And as you've seen, many of the organizations have freely published some standards that could help the authorities, but that could also help consumers to learn about these standards on how to protect themselves or how to respond to this event. And also, the pandemic has forced us to have virtual meetings, and the fact that we are doing everything now from home since the last 2 years has also facilitated the way in which we participate in the national committees of the different national organizations whenever they're doing some follow-up on an international or a national standard. So that could really facilitate the work of all of you who are working with different authorities, health authorities, so that you can follow through the different technical committees that exist in your countries. Something that I seemed is very interesting is a comment that Cesnev from Cuba mentioned on the work that's done. I don't know if you would like to mention something of the CESMED You can open your microphone. Otherwise, I could read your comment, but I think that it would be more interesting to hear from you. So good morning. We are here from the Cuban Regulatory Authority for Drugs and Medical Devices, known as SEXMED. Here in the area of medical devices, we are working very closely with the National Standardization Office, with the Technical Committee 11 for medical devices and Technical Committee 102 for diagnosis devices. You know, that's what we call them here in Cuba, the in vitro diagnosis devices. And we work together with international and national standards, as I mentioned there in the chat. And we also work together on a list of the standards that are acknowledged for the work that the regulatory authorities have to carry out so that they can show that they're following all the principles, the essential principles of safety, efficiency, and development, as many others. Here, for technical standards, in those that are approved both nationally and internationally, they are done by a specific department. For example, we have the adoption of ISO 13405, and we're currently working in adopting the approved translation of the 14961, the standards of the family 10993. And so, I mean, we have all of these standards, and in total, we have 60 standards that we have adopted from international standards. The work that is done is very close-knit work, both for the regulatory functions, I mean, for the standardization work works together with the regulatory agencies where medical devices are involved. So we work with all of them all the time. Thank you very much. Thank you for this comment. And I also want to take advantage of the fact that in the Q&A session, well, Veronica Biskovich from IRAM Argentina answered something. So maybe, Veronica, you could talk very briefly about how IRAM is working and how we can find the standards catalogs. It's very similar to the other organizations, but maybe you could mention that to us. Hello, everybody. So in our classification, we use the international classification of ICS. We have different standardization organizations that study medical devices or electromedical devices also. And I lost my train of thought. I apologize. And I put that because there are several people that are asking about how they could find the standards catalog. So if you could mention about that. Yeah, yes, we have a documentation center where we can do the query. And first we see if it's a specific query by a medical essay, you know, and the coordinator of that. And if it's something that needs to be searched nationally or internationally. Thank you. Perfect. So if any of the
que ya hablaron, pero la mayoría de los organismos nacionales de normalización tienen en su página web su catálogo de normas, algunos con ya herramientas de búsquedas. Entonces ahí pueden acudir. Si tienen dudas de saber quién es el organismo nacional de normalización en su país, pueden entrar a la página web de COPANT o de la ISO para ver cuál es el organismo nacional de normalización en cada país.
And find out who is a standardization entity in each country so that you can find out about the catalog. I have another question, and maybe I could ask the panel members who presented if you could open your camera so we can see you. There is a question in the chat from Robson Castro that says, in case, if an importer complies with quality standards for medical devices described in your local standards, should they also comply with the local guidelines, or should it be acknowledged that they are following the international standards? It's if an importer complies with quality standards for medical devices described in local guidelines, should they also comply with local standards, or is they have this acknowledgement? Well, thank you. And in the case of Mexico, the law is establishing and privileging the execution of mutual acknowledgement or equivalence agreements. So in this case, that what they're presenting in the question is if you prove that there is a certificate that has been issued in the country of origin, and if this comes from a certified organization, and if there has been an agreement of a mutual agreement, mutual acknowledgement agreement executed, then it's easy to recognize those and to prevent this double certification. It also has to do with the infrastructure that we have in Mexico. If we don't have the infrastructure to assess conformity, then we would be thinking about establishing this equivalent agreement. That's new in the infrastructure law. And to recognize this unilaterally or to see also what are the results of evaluating conformity. So there's definitely several paths and several tools. And if there's no regulation in Mexico for that, we cannot demand something that cannot be proven, you know? So if there is a certified international organization that establishes this mutual agreement, mutual acknowledgement agreement, then through that, we can prevent this double certification that they're mentioning in the case of imports. Thank you, Emeterio. Soraya. Thank you. And it's a very interesting question because that is the other phase. Now we have the standard, how it is applied and implemented. In the case of Peru, and I think that for our countries, it's necessary to review the legislation that exists for that specific product. And each product has a minimum requirements to comply with, depending on if there is or no regulation. In general, for all the products here, require this orientation. In the case of imports, the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism in the email OTC of Peru, they cover those type of consults. Whenever some of the users want to import or export certain products, they can help you with this information. And regarding these mutual acknowledgement agreements, well, they work here in Peru under the framework of the international acknowledgement framework. And so we have worked on this international acknowledgement agreements in whatever has been necessary, you know, and if we have these mutual acknowledgement agreements for an international standard, well, then yes, it is fully acknowledged. But it has to do the consultation through the accreditation direction because they also, it's part of the INDACAL and they have to see if that is correct. So that's part of the answer of what happens here in Peru. And yes, I mean, these mutual acknowledgement agreements do facilitate this double certification in most of the countries, you know, or having to present these double tests because that also delays the entrance of the product. So thank you very much. Thank you, Soraya, for this clarification and Emeterio. And well, because of time constraints, we're going to finish with this session. I want to thank all the panel members for all the information that you've provided and also for answering the different questions in the chat and in the I would ask all the participants to read the questions that you've included. There are many links that are quite interesting for all of you. And well, hopefully from the point of view of the national standardization organizations, then from that point of view, you received a very clear message and hopefully you're also clear on the importance of all the interested parties, of everybody participating in the technical committees, the national technical committees, and the mirror committees, whenever you are following international work that's being done, because it is important to have access to international standards, to translate them into our own languages, but it's also more important to be part of the process of developing these international standards. I mean, not only adopting them, but being part of their participation. So thank you, everybody. And Sandra, I'll pass the floor back to you. Thank you, Cody, and thank you to all the panel members. And Besa, if you want to open your camera for the closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Corey, and thank you to all the speakers today. I thought that we had a really good informative session. Just to summarize, this is the third session of the series. In the previous sessions, we heard how important international standards are to operationalize regulatory reliance, the impact of trade agreements and obligations, and the activities being conducted by standards development organizations for harmonization of standards. And today we had an opportunity to hear from the national standards bodies, from our colleagues in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. And they really, we heard their experience and how they participate in the international standard development. We do appreciate hearing all these different perspectives and bringing those different perspectives to the webinar. We do, as we heard from Corey and others speakers today and previously, being involved in standards development and utilization of standards is really important. We do encourage the participation of the regulators and industry to engage in these standards activities. As we've heard, using standards really helps create systems that are more harmonized and more efficient for regulators and industry, which improves quality and safety of medical devices overall. Again, I just wanted to take another opportunity to thank the speakers and all the participants today. We hope that you have found these sessions informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Besa. Pues muchas gracias a todos.
So thank you, everybody. And I just want to remind all of you that next week, we are going to have the fourth and last session of the series. And there we're going to have the participation to
evaluación de la conformidad, que
all
es
of you to review the evaluation of conformity topic. You know, that's kind of like the final point of everything that we've talked about these days. And we're also going to have the participation of Brazil, COFEPRIS, and the Mexican Pharmacopeia, as well as the Ministry of Health and INVIMA in Colombia. And they're going to be sharing with us their experience in the use of international standards as the base for the regulations, at the base for their everyday work. So I want to invite all of you to participate in next week's session. And we thank you. We thank all the panel members that were here today and all the participants. It's clear that we have a lot of interest of learning about this topic, and that's fantastic because at the end of the day, the participation, the collaboration of all the stakeholders is what actually will guarantee success in all of our work. So thank you very much, and we expect to see you next Thursday. Have a great rest of the day.